There are moments in history that do not begin with a single clear sound. They begin instead with silence. A kind of quiet that settles over the world after something immense has ended. In 1918, that silence followed the First World War. Cities still stood, but they felt different now, like they had been emptied of something unseen. Factories slowed their wartime rhythm. Railroads carried fewer troops and more returning men, and across continents, people began to wake up into a world that no longer felt familiar, not yet peaceful, but no longer entirely at war. For many, it was difficult to know what to do with that quiet. After years of urgency, of loss, of waiting for news that arrived too late or not at all, the world suddenly had space again. And into that space, something new began to form. Not all at once. Not loudly. But gradually, like a distant radio being tuned into the right frequency. The 1920s did not begin as roaring. They began as searching. Searching for comfort. For distraction. For meaning after a decade that had taken so much and explained so little. In the United States, the economy began to shift. Factories that had once produced war supplies turned toward consumer goods. Cars, radios, household appliances. Things that promised ease, speed, and connection. In cities, electric lights stretched further into the night than ever before. Streets did not sleep the way they once had. Music could be heard spilling from open doors and crowded rooms, even in the late hours. And yet, beneath all of it, there was still a kind of uncertainty. Because history does not change direction cleanly. It turns slowly, like a great ship in deep water. For many people, life still felt fragile. Farmers in rural areas struggled with falling prices. Workers in cities found new opportunities, but also new pressures, and the memory of war still lingered quietly in conversation, in newspapers, in the spaces between words. But the younger generation, the ones who had grown up during the war or come of age just after it, they began to move differently. They dressed differently. They spoke differently. They danced differently. And slowly, almost without anyone fully agreeing on it, a new cultural rhythm began to emerge. One that felt faster, brighter, more restless. This was the beginning of what would later be called the Roaring Twenties, a name that suggests noise, energy, celebration. But like so many names given after the fact, it does not fully capture what it felt like to live inside it. Because for the people who experienced it day by day, it was not always roaring. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was uncertain. And sometimes it was simply change happening so gradually that it was only noticed in hindsight. In the years that followed, cities would grow taller. Music would grow bolder. Fashion would grow freer. And the world would seem, for a time, to speed up as if it had suddenly learned it could move faster than before. But at the very beginning, there was only the feeling that something had shifted, something subtle, like the air itself had changed temperature. And as the 1920s began to unfold, people would step forward into that new air without fully knowing where it would lead, only that it would not lead them back. In the years just after 1918, the world did not immediately feel like a new world. It felt more like an old world that had been quietly emptied out. The First World War had ended, but its presence still lingered in ways that were difficult to describe, not as something visible or always spoken aloud, but as a kind of heaviness in the air, as if the atmosphere itself had not yet recovered. Cities still stood, but they seemed slightly altered. Train stations were still busy, streets still carried voices and footsteps, shop windows still reflected passing lives. and yet there was a subtle difference in how people moved through them. A little slower, a little more cautious, as though everyone was still learning how to exist without urgency pressing in from every direction. Millions of soldiers returned home during these years. They came back to towns that had continued without them, to families that had learned new rhythms of survival, to jobs that had changed or disappeared entirely, and to a kind of silence that felt unfamiliar after the constant noise of war. For some, returning meant relief. For others, it meant disorientation. The world they remembered no longer matched the world in front of them, and so they carried something of the war with them, even when the war itself was gone. Not always in visible ways, but in memory, in habits, in the quiet pauses between conversations. At the same time, entire societies were trying to rebuild. Factories that had once been focused entirely on war production began shifting towards civilian goods. Steel, textiles, machinery, now redirected toward everyday life. The economy, in many places, began to grow again. Slowly at first, then more steadily. There was a sense that something had broken open, and now something new was trying to take its place. But recovery was not evenly felt. In cities, there were new opportunities. Jobs in industry, transportation, and emerging technologies began to expand. Electricity was becoming more common in homes. Streetlights stretched further into the night, making darkness feel less absolute than it once had. But in rural areas, the story was different. Farmers who had expanded production during the war suddenly found themselves facing falling prices. Fields that had once symbolized prosperity now carried uncertainty. The same world was producing both growth and strain, depending on where one stood. And beneath it all, there was still the shadow of another event that had passed only a few years earlier. The influenza pandemic of 1918 had moved through the world with quiet speed. It left behind millions of deaths, and in many places, a lingering awareness of how fragile daily life could be. Even as it faded from headlines, it did not fully fade from memory. People still remembered crowded hospitals, still remembered empty streets, still remembered how quickly normal life could disappear. So as the 1920s approached, there was a strange combination of feelings: relief, but also caution; hope, but also fatigue; and above all, a desire not to remain in the same emotional place for too long. It was in this atmosphere that modern life began to shift, not in a single dramatic moment, but through small changes that gradually accumulated. Radio technology began to spread, slowly connecting distant places through sound. Cars became more common, changing the way people understood distance itself. Cities expanded outward and upward, as if trying to match the speed of the age. And younger generations, especially those who had grown up during or just after the war, began to feel that the world did not need to be lived in the same way it had been before. There was a quiet rejection of old rhythms, of old restrictions, of old expectations. It was not always rebellion in the loud sense. Sometimes it was simply preference, a choice to move differently, to speak differently, to dress differently, to listen to different kinds of music. And as these small choices multiplied across thousands of cities and towns, a broader cultural shift began to take shape. A sense that life itself could be reorganized, that it could move faster, that it could feel lighter, that it could be, in some way, reinvented. But in these early years after the war, nothing about that transformation was fully clear yet. People did not yet call it an era of change. They were still inside the transition itself, still adjusting, still recovering, still learning what it meant to live in a world where the old certainty had disappeared, and something new, something faster, brighter, and less predictable, was slowly beginning to emerge in its place. And as the decade moved forward, that slow emergence would begin to take shape more clearly. In music, in cities, in fashion, in technology, and in the restless feeling that would come to define the years ahead. But at the beginning of it all, there was only this: a world after war, trying, quietly, to become something else. In the years after the war, something began to happen to the shape of the world itself. Not all at once, not in a way that could be easily pointed to on a map, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, cities began to feel different, as though they were waking up from a long sleep. The streets grew busier, the buildings grew taller, the nights grew brighter, and life, in general, began to feel more compressed, more concentrated, as if more and more human experience was being folded into smaller and smaller spaces. Cities like New York, Chicago, London, and Paris became symbols of this change, places where the old rhythm of life, slow, seasonal, tied to land and distance, began to give way to something faster, something vertical, something electric. Skyscrapers rose not just as buildings, but as statements, tall, structured, geometric expressions of ambition. Steel frames reaching upward, holding glass and light in new arrangements. To stand at the base of these buildings was to feel a kind of quiet insignificance, as if the earth itself had been briefly left behind. Inside these cities, electricity was becoming more than a convenience. It was becoming an atmosphere. Streetlights turned night into something navigable. Subway systems carried crowds beneath the surface like hidden rivers of movement. Elevators replaced long stair climbs, compressing distance into seconds. And all of it contributed to a new sensation: speed without motion. Life was not only moving faster, it felt faster. At the same time, rural life continued in its own slower rhythm. Fields still needed tending. Weather still dictated work. Seasons still shaped survival. But increasingly, there was a pull away from the countryside and toward the city, a migration of people seeking work, opportunity, or simply a different kind of life. This movement reshaped the population of entire nations. Families left farms that had been in their possession for generations. Young people left small towns where everyone knew each other's names, and they entered cities where anonymity itself became part of the experience. In the city, one could be surrounded by thousands of people and still feel unknown. But that anonymity also carried a strange kind of freedom. No fixed expectations, no inherited roles, just possibility. And possibility, in the 1920s, was beginning to feel like a defining feature of modern life. Factories expanded to meet new demands. Assembly lines continued to refine the production of automobiles, appliances, and consumer goods. The Model T Ford, in particular, became a symbol of this transformation, not because it was luxurious or rare, but because it was accessible. It brought movement to people who had never before experienced it in such a personal way. Roads began to matter in new ways. Distances that once felt significant began to shrink in perception. A town a few hours away no longer felt distant in the same emotional sense. It felt reachable. Even ordinary landscapes began to change under this new logic of movement. Gas stations appeared along roads that had once been simple dirt paths. Roadside diners began to serve travelers who were always passing through. The idea of travel itself began to shift from something rare to something routine. And above all this movement, cities continued to grow upward. steel and glass structures rising in layered silhouettes against the sky, windows reflecting not just sunlight, but other buildings, other lives, other moments happening at the same time. There was something almost reflective about the modern city. It did not simply contain life. It mirrored it. Radio towers began to appear as well, quietly marking another kind of transformation. Sound itself was no longer limited by proximity. A voice in one place could now be heard in another, far away, almost instantly. This created a new kind of shared experience. People who had never met were listening to the same broadcasts, hearing the same music, following the same stories. The city was no longer just a physical space. It was becoming part of a wider network of connection. And yet, for all this expansion and acceleration, there was also a sense of adjustment. People were still learning how to live in this new environment, how to navigate crowds that never seemed to thin, how to process information that arrived more quickly than before, how to find stillness inside spaces that rarely paused. There were moments in quieter hours when the city almost seemed to breathe differently. Early mornings before the streets filled. Late nights when the lights glowed softly against empty sidewalks. In those moments, the modern world felt less like motion and more like structure, a vast, organized presence slowly settling into place. And as the 1920s continued to unfold, cities would become the stage for nearly every major change of the decade. Culture, music, fashion, technology, all of it gathering in these dense, vertical spaces. But in these early years of transformation, nothing yet felt complete. Only in motion, only forming, only beginning to understand what it meant to live in a world that was no longer spread out and distant, but gathered together, stacked, connected, and quietly, continuously waking up. In the quiet years after the war, before the decade fully understood itself, something began to emerge in the background of daily life. At first, it was not called anything grand. It was not described as a movement or an era or a revolution. It was simply sound, soft, shifting, and unfamiliar. In the early streets of New Orleans, music had already been forming for years before the 1920s truly began. A blending of traditions that had traveled through generations. African rhythms, European harmonies, blues expressions shaped by lived experience, and improvisation that did not follow strict written rules. It was music that did not ask to be perfect. It asked only to be felt. And slowly, that sound began to travel. Not all at once. Not in a straight line. But like something drifting through open doors and long corridors, finding new rooms to live in. As musicians moved northward, toward cities like Chicago and New York, the sound changed slightly with each stop. It adapted to new audiences, new instruments, new spaces. In Chicago, it became sharper, more energetic, shaped by crowded clubs and bustling urban nights. In New York, it stretched further, filling larger rooms and blending with the pace of a growing metropolis. And everywhere it went, it carried the same quiet sense of freedom. Jazz was not just a style of music. It was a way of breaking from structure, a way of speaking without fixed sentences, a way of allowing silence and sound to exist together without needing to resolve into something predictable. In a world still adjusting after war, that unpredictability felt new, even unsettling, and yet deeply alive. At night, in hidden clubs and dimly lit rooms, people gathered to listen. Some places were legal, many were not. The atmosphere often felt separate from the daylight world, as if the city had folded in on itself after dark and created a different kind of geography. Music spilled out into alleys, into stairwells, into conversations that paused when the band began to play. There was something about jazz that encouraged attention without effort. It did not demand understanding in the traditional sense. It invited presence. To simply listen. To simply be there. As the 1920s moved forward, the spread of radio began to change the scale of this sound. What had once been local, tied to specific rooms, specific cities, specific nights, could now travel. A performance in one place could be heard in another, far away, almost as if the space between them had been temporarily erased. For the first time, music could feel both intimate and widespread at the same time. A shared experience without shared location. This shift quietly changed the nature of culture itself. People who would never meet were now hearing the same melodies, following the same rhythms, experiencing the same emotional tones in different rooms, different homes, different cities. And as jazz spread, it began to influence more than just music. It shaped how people moved, how they danced, how they expressed themselves in social spaces that were also changing during this decade. Dance halls became more active, more expressive, less restrained than in earlier eras. Movements became looser, more improvisational, reflecting the music itself. There was a sense, subtle but present, that structure was loosening in many areas of life. Not only in art, but in behavior, in fashion, in conversation, in the ways people allowed themselves to exist in public. The younger generation especially seemed drawn to this shift. They were less attached to older forms of formality, less interested in repeating the strict social patterns of previous decades, and more interested in expression that felt immediate, personal, unplanned. Jazz, in many ways, became the sound of that shift, a reflection of a world experimenting with its own flexibility. But it was not universally accepted. For some, it felt chaotic, unrefined, too loose, too unpredictable. It challenged older ideas of order, especially in music that had long been associated with strict composition and structure. And so, like many cultural changes of the 1920s, it existed in tension, between old and new, between control and freedom, between familiarity and uncertainty. Still, the sound continued to grow, moving from small clubs into larger venues, from local scenes into national awareness, from hidden corners of cities into the broader cultural imagination. And with each step, it became more than just music. It became a symbol of change that could not be fully contained, of expression that did not follow permission, of a world learning, slowly and unevenly, how to move beyond the boundaries it had once accepted without question. But in these early moments, nothing felt fully defined yet. Jazz was still forming itself in real time, still being shaped by the hands and breath and instincts of the musicians who played it, still drifting through cities like a quiet current beneath the louder surface of modern life. And as the 1920s continued to unfold, that current would grow stronger, deeper, more visible, until it became one of the defining sounds of an entire age. But here, at the beginning of its wider journey, it was still just a whisper, moving through the night, waiting to be heard. At the start of the 1920s, something unusual happened across the United States. A law was passed that attempted to remove alcohol from public life entirely. It was called prohibition, and on paper, it seemed like a simple idea. If alcohol was banned, then its social problems, addiction, disorder, public drunkenness, would also disappear. But history rarely responds so neatly to simple ideas. Instead, it shifts. It bends. It finds ways to continue in new forms. The 18th Amendment went into effect in 1920, followed by the Volstead Act, which defined how the ban would be enforced. Brewing, selling, and transporting alcohol became illegal. And just like that, a major part of social life in the United States was officially removed from legality. But not from existence. In fact, something unexpected happened almost immediately. Alcohol did not disappear. It moved. It went underground. Quietly, at first. Then more openly, in hidden spaces that began to spread through cities. These spaces became known as speakeasies. Unmarked doors. Back rooms. Basements behind ordinary storefronts. Places that did not advertise themselves, but were known through word of mouth, through trust, through familiarity. Inside them, life continued in a way that was both familiar and slightly transformed. Music played softly or loudly depending on the room. People gathered not only to drink, but to socialize, to escape, to participate in something that now existed outside official approval. The city at night began to develop a kind of double identity. By day, it followed rules. By night, it adapted. And in this adaptation, a new layer of culture quietly formed. But prohibition had consequences far beyond hidden bars. Because whenever something is made illegal, the question of enforcement becomes central. And enforcement proved difficult. The country was large. The borders were long. The demand for alcohol remained strong. And so, a new kind of economy began to emerge alongside the official one. An underground system of production and distribution. Smuggling routes. Secret distilleries. And networks of people who operated outside the law. In many cities, organized crime expanded rapidly during this period, not because it suddenly appeared, but because opportunity expanded. Where there was demand without legal supply, someone would eventually step in to fill the gap. This created a strange dual reality. On the surface, laws were clear. In practice, enforcement was inconsistent. Some communities followed prohibition more strictly. Others treated it as a guideline rather than a rule. And in between those extremes, countless variations of compliance and resistance developed. Law enforcement agencies found themselves stretched thin. Coastlines, rivers, and borders became points of constant tension. And yet, despite these efforts, alcohol remained widely available in many places, just less visible, more controlled by informal networks, more tied to secrecy than to public commerce. In cities like New York and Chicago, speakeasies multiplied. Some were small and hidden behind ordinary doors. Others were elaborate, designed to feel like private worlds removed from the outside law. They often required passwords, or introductions, or knowledge passed quietly from person to person. Inside them, the atmosphere could feel almost suspended, as if the outside world had been temporarily set aside. Music became an essential part of this environment. Jazz, in particular, flourished in these spaces. Its improvisational nature matched the unpredictability of the environment itself. Nothing in a speakeasy felt fully fixed. Not the rules, not the schedule, not even the social boundaries, which often blurred in ways that would have been less common in earlier decades. There was a sense of shared secrecy that shaped behavior, a quiet understanding that what happened here existed in a separate category from everyday life. But prohibition was not only about nightlife. It also reflected deeper cultural tensions between tradition and modernity, between moral reform movements and personal freedom, between those who believed society needed stricter boundaries, and those who believed those boundaries were becoming outdated. For some, prohibition represented progress, a cleaner, more orderly society. For others, it represented restriction, a limitation placed on everyday life that felt disconnected from reality. And so, the decade carried both responses at once: compliance and resistance, support and opposition, law and workaround, all existing simultaneously, often in the same city, sometimes even in the same neighborhood. Over time, the contradictions became more visible. The gap between intention and outcome widened, and prohibition, instead of simplifying society, revealed its complexity. It showed how difficult it is to regulate something deeply embedded in culture, and how quickly new systems can form when old ones are removed. By the middle of the decade, speakeasies were no longer unusual. They had become part of the urban landscape, not officially acknowledged, but widely understood, a quiet parallel world existing alongside the formal one. And in that parallel world, music, conversation, and movement continued late into the night. Soft lights, low ceilings, hidden entrances, the feeling of being slightly outside time. As the 1920s moved forward, prohibition would continue to shape social life in ways both intended and unintended. It would influence crime. It would influence politics. It would influence culture. And it would eventually come to be seen not as a simple moral reform, but as a complicated chapter in the story of a changing society. But in these early years, its effects were still unfolding, still spreading, still reshaping how cities moved after dark. And beneath it all, the same pattern continued to emerge again and again throughout the decade. When one form of structure was removed, another would appear in its place, sometimes legal, sometimes informal, sometimes entirely new. And in that tension between rules and reality, the Roaring Twenties continued to take shape. In the middle of the 1920s, something subtle began to change in the way people saw each other. Not in laws, not in governments, but in appearance, in movement, in the quiet signals that people used to understand one another in public spaces. Fashion, in this period, began to shift in ways that reflected a deeper transformation happening beneath the surface of society. And at the center of that shift was a new cultural figure that came to define the decade in memory: the flapper. At first, the term itself was informal, even slightly dismissive in some contexts. It referred to young women who seemed to move differently from previous generations, who dressed differently, who spoke differently, who carried themselves with a kind of independence that older social expectations did not fully account for. Their dresses were shorter than what had been considered appropriate in earlier decades. Their hair was often cut into bobbed styles that framed the face more openly. Their silhouettes were less restrictive, less structured, more fluid in motion. And while these changes might seem purely aesthetic, they carried deeper meaning. Because clothing, in any society, is never just clothing. It is a language, a way of communicating belonging, identity, and expectation. And in the 1920s, that language was being rewritten. The flapper became a symbol of modernity not only because of how she looked, but because of how she moved through the world. There was a sense of independence in her presence, a sense of autonomy in how she occupied space. She was often associated with nightlife, dance halls, jazz clubs, and social gatherings where music and movement blended into long evenings of expression. But she also represented something more subtle. a shift in how young women imagined their futures. In the years after World War I, many traditional structures of family and social expectation were already under pressure. Women had entered the workforce during the war in large numbers. They had taken on roles that had previously been reserved for men. And even as some of those roles receded after the war, the sense of possibility did not fully disappear. Instead, it lingered, and slowly reshaped expectations. In many countries, women also gained or expanded voting rights during this period. In the United States, the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote in 1920. This was not simply a legal change. It was part of a broader cultural shift in how women were seen in public life. As citizens, as participants, as individuals with voices that extended beyond private spaces. And so, when the flapper appeared in the cultural imagination, she was not entirely new. She was the visible expression of changes that had already been building. Still, she was controversial in some circles. To some, she represented freedom, energy, modern life itself. To others, she represented a break from tradition that felt unsettling, a departure from established norms of modesty, behavior, and social order. And like many symbols of the 1920s, she existed in both admiration and criticism at the same time. But beyond the debates and opinions, there was something undeniably significant happening in everyday life. Young people were beginning to define identity more independently from older generations. They were influenced by new forms of media, by music, by film, by urban life, and by the simple fact that the world they had inherited no longer resembled the world of their parents in the same direct way. Dance played a major role in this transformation. In ballrooms and clubs, movement became more expressive, less rigid. The structure of earlier formal dances gave way to styles that allowed for improvisation and personal expression. Music and body language began to merge in ways that felt spontaneous and alive. Jazz, which had been growing in popularity, provided the perfect backdrop for this shift. Its rhythms did not demand strict adherence. They invited variation, response, individual interpretation. And so, in dance halls across cities, people moved in ways that reflected the broader cultural changes of the decade. Less restraint, more spontaneity, more willingness to exist in the moment rather than follow carefully prescribed forms. Fashion and behavior evolved together. Clothing became more practical for movement. Accessories and styles reflected new ideas of elegance that were less tied to formality and more tied to expression. Even cosmetics became more widely used in public life, contributing to a broader shift in how appearance was understood socially. But underneath all of this change was a quieter question, one that was not always spoken directly. How much of identity is inherited, and how much of it is chosen? The flapper, in cultural memory, became a figure who seemed to answer that question in a new way, not by rejecting the past entirely, but by exploring what might exist beyond it. Still, the decade was not uniform. For every space where modern identity was embraced, there were others where traditional expectations remained strong. Rural areas often held onto older norms more firmly than cities. Different communities experienced the 1920s in very different ways. And even within cities, generations often interpreted the same changes in completely different ways. So the flapper was never a universal figure. She was a focal point, a visible expression of a broader and more complex shift. As the decade continued, these cultural changes would expand further, influencing work, education, politics, and the general understanding of personal freedom. But in this moment, In the middle years of the 1920s, everything still felt in motion, not fully settled, not fully defined, only emerging, like a new language being spoken for the first time, in many voices at once. In the 1920s, there was a kind of quiet revolution happening that did not rely on buildings, laws, or even physical movement. It traveled through the air, invisible, unseen, but deeply present in everyday life. Radio began as a technology experiment, something still finding its purpose in the early years of the decade. But almost without anyone fully noticing the moment it happened, it became something more. It became a shared experience. For the first time in history, sound could travel across distance instantly, without needing a physical object to carry it. A voice in one city could be heard in another. Music performed in one place could fill homes far away. And in that simple shift, something profound changed about how people experienced the world. Before radio, most information and entertainment were local. You went somewhere to hear music. You went somewhere to see a performance. You relied on newspapers for distant events, often delayed and filtered through interpretation. But radio collapsed distance. It brought immediacy into the home, and slowly it began to reshape daily life around it. Families would gather in living rooms in the evening, not around a fireplace alone, but around a small glowing device that carried voices and music from elsewhere. The radio became a kind of invisible guest in the household, present but not physical, constant but always changing. News broadcasts created a shared sense of time across regions. People who had never met were hearing the same reports at the same moment. Music broadcasts created shared emotional experiences across cities and states. A song played in one place could be recognized everywhere, and without fully realizing it, society was beginning to synchronize itself, not just in information, but in feeling, in rhythm, in attention. This was one of the quiet foundations of modern mass culture. The idea that large numbers of people could experience the same cultural moment simultaneously. That entertainment was no longer limited by geography, and that identity itself could begin to form through shared media. With radio came a new kind of public figure, the voice without a face, the personality known through sound alone. Announcers, performers, musicians, and early celebrities began to exist in a slightly different space than those of earlier eras. They were not just local performers. They were national presences, known across wide distances without ever being physically present in those places. This shift also changed advertising. Companies quickly realized that radio could reach millions of listeners at once. And so, advertising became more direct, more personal in tone, more integrated into the experience of listening itself. The modern idea of marketing began to take shape here, not just as information about products, but as a form of persuasion embedded in everyday life. At the same time, radio contributed to a growing sense of shared culture. News stories were no longer isolated to specific towns or cities. They became national conversations. Sports events were broadcast, allowing people far from stadiums to experience games as they happened. Music trends spread faster than ever before, and cultural moments that might once have remained regional began to feel widespread almost immediately. This created a subtle but important shift in how people understood connection. Distance mattered less in terms of experience. You could be physically far from a place and still feel emotionally close to it through sound. There was something almost intimate about this. A voice entering the home without being invited in physically, speaking directly into private spaces, creating a sense of presence without presence. And like many innovations of the 1920s, radio carried both excitement and uncertainty. For some, it felt like progress in its purest form, a way to connect people across great distances, to share music, news, and stories more efficiently than ever before. For others, it raised questions about influence, about control of information, about how much of daily life was now being shaped by unseen voices beyond the home. But regardless of interpretation, the change was already underway. Radio had become part of the structure of everyday life, and with it, culture itself began to take on a new scale. What had once been fragmented across towns and regions was now becoming increasingly unified. Shared references, shared sounds, shared moments. This did not eliminate local culture, but it layered something new on top of it. A national, and in some cases international, cultural rhythm that people could participate in simultaneously. And in the quiet hours of the evening, when radios glowed softly in living rooms, this new rhythm became especially clear. A voice speaking into silence, music drifting through static, stories unfolding in real time across invisible networks. The world, for the first time, was beginning to feel less like separate places, and more like a connected space of shared experience. And as the 1920s continued, this sense of connection would only deepen. Through film, through advertising, through technology, through culture itself learning how to move faster than geography could contain. But here, in the age of early radio, it was still new enough to feel remarkable. A quiet signal passing through the air, linking distant lives together, one broadcast at a time. In the 1920s, one of the most visible signs that the world was changing was not found in music halls or radio broadcasts. It was found on the road. A growing number of machines began to move through streets, towns, and open landscapes with a steady, mechanical confidence. The automobile. At first, cars were still something of a luxury, something novel, something that drew attention when it passed by. But as the decade continued, they became increasingly common. And with that change, something fundamental shifted in how people understood distance, time, and movement. The automobile did not just replace older forms of transportation. It redefined the meaning of space itself. Before widespread car ownership, travel was slow, tied to rail lines, horse routes, or walking paths. Journeys were planned carefully, often infrequently, and shaped by the limitations of physical endurance or infrastructure. But the car introduced something new: individual mobility, the ability to decide, at any moment, to move from one place to another without depending on fixed schedules or routes. This autonomy quietly changed behavior. People began to think differently about where they could go, how far they could live from where they worked, what kinds of places were accessible in a single day. And gradually, the world felt smaller, not because it physically shrank, but because it became more reachable. One of the key forces behind this transformation was mass production. Factories, especially those influenced by assembly line techniques, made it possible to produce automobiles at a scale and speed previously unimaginable. Parts moved through structured sequences of labor, each step contributing to a finished machine that could be built faster and more affordably than before. This industrial efficiency lowered costs over time, making cars accessible to a wider portion of the population. And as ownership expanded, the presence of automobiles began to reshape not just roads, but entire landscapes. New infrastructure emerged to support this growing mode of travel. Roads were expanded and paved. Intersections became more complex. Traffic patterns began to matter in ways they had not before. Even the layout of towns and cities started to shift in response. Gas stations appeared along routes that had once been simple stretches of road. Roadside businesses adapted to passing travelers. Diners, motels, and service stops became part of a new kind of geography, one defined by movement rather than permanence. Suburban areas also began to expand. With personal transportation available, it became possible for some people to live farther from city centers while still maintaining access to urban employment and resources. This changed the shape of daily life. Homes were no longer required to be tightly clustered around workplaces or transit hubs. Instead, they could spread outward, following roads rather than rail lines. And in this expansion, a new rhythm of living emerged, one defined by commuting, by regular movement between separate spaces of life, home, work, leisure. The car became more than a machine. It became a structure that organized time. But alongside its practical effects, the automobile also carried a cultural meaning. It represented freedom, speed, modern independence, the ability to move without waiting, to choose direction in real time, to leave and return on personal terms. In many ways, it symbolized the broader spirit of the 1920s, a decade increasingly defined by acceleration, not just in transportation, but in communication, entertainment, and lifestyle. Music moved faster through radio. Ideas spread more quickly through mass media. Fashion changed at a more visible pace. Even social life seemed to operate with less delay between intention and action. The car fit neatly into this environment. It was both a tool and a symbol of modernity. But this new speed also introduced new complexities. Traffic, once non-existent, became a regular concern. Accidents became more common. Urban planning had to adapt to a world where movement was no longer predictable in the same way, and the relationship between people and distance became more abstract. A place that was nearby no longer meant walking distance. It meant driving time, and driving time itself could vary depending on conditions, roads, and growing congestion. Still, despite these adjustments, the overall trajectory was clear. Life was becoming more mobile, more flexible, more distributed across space. And in that mobility, people began to experience a new kind of relationship with the world around them, not fixed in place, but constantly in potential motion. The automobile did not just change transportation, it changed expectation. The expectation that movement was possible, that distance was negotiable, that life could be organized around choice rather than constraint. And as the 1920s continued, this expectation would extend beyond roads and vehicles, into housing, into work, into leisure, into the very idea of how a modern life could be structured. But in these early years of widespread adoption, the transformation still felt fresh, visible, almost exciting in its novelty, a machine that did not just carry people forward, but quietly changed the way they understood where forward even was. In the 1920s, another kind of world began to take shape alongside the cities, the radios, and the growing network of roads. A world made not of steel or sound waves, but of light and shadow. Cinema, still relatively young in the early part of the decade, was quietly transforming into something far larger than anyone had originally imagined. What had begun as short moving pictures shown in simple theaters or traveling exhibitions was evolving into a full cultural industry. And at the center of it was Hollywood, not yet the global symbol it would later become, but already forming its identity as a place where stories could be constructed out of images, gestures, and silence. In the early 1920s, films were still largely silent. Actors did not rely on spoken dialogue. Instead, they used expression, movement, and timing to communicate emotion and narrative. Intertitles provided written context, but much of the storytelling depended on visual clarity. This created a unique language, one that did not require translation in the traditional sense. A story could be understood across languages, across regions, across countries, simply through what was seen on the screen. And because of this, film began to travel easily, more easily than literature, more easily than stage performances. It could be reproduced, distributed, and shown in countless theaters, reaching audiences that were far larger and more diverse than earlier forms of entertainment had ever reached. In cities across the United States and Europe, movie theaters became central spaces of public life, not necessarily grand at first, but increasingly elaborate as the decade progressed. Ornate interiors, dim lighting, a sense of entering a separate environment, distinct from the everyday world outside. Inside these spaces, audiences shared experiences in real time, laughing, reacting, sitting in collective silence as stories unfolded on the screen. And in that shared attention, cinema began to shape a new kind of cultural unity. Certain actors began to rise above the screen itself, becoming recognizable not through voice, but through face and movement. Charlie Chaplin, with his carefully crafted character and expressive physical comedy, became one of the most recognizable figures of the silent film era. His work demonstrated something important about this new medium, that emotion could be communicated without speech, that humor, sadness, and reflection could exist in gesture alone. Other figures followed, each contributing to the developing vocabulary of cinema. Film studios began to organize production more systematically. Writing, directing, acting, and editing became increasingly structured processes. What had once been experimental became industrial, a form of storytelling that could be produced at scale. Hollywood, as a location, became central to this transformation not only because of its geography and climate, but because it allowed for year-round production. Light, landscape, and distance from older theatrical traditions all contributed to its growth, and gradually it became a place associated not just with filmmaking, but with aspiration itself. The idea that ordinary people could become something larger than life through performance. At the same time, movie theaters became more than just entertainment venues. They became social spaces, places where people dressed for the occasion, where evenings were planned around showtimes, where stories became shared cultural reference points. A film released in one city could quickly become known in another, not instantly, like radio, but steadily, through distribution and word of mouth. This created a slower but still powerful form of cultural connection. And unlike live theater, film could be repeated exactly. The same performance preserved and shown again and again. This introduced something new to modern culture: reproducibility. The idea that art and entertainment could exist in stable, repeatable forms across time and space. As the 1920s continued, film also began to influence other areas of life. Fashion trends inspired by actors and actresses began to appear in everyday clothing. Hairstyles, gestures, and styles of expression began to reflect cinematic influence. Even the idea of celebrity itself began to change. Fame was no longer limited to local or regional recognition. It could now be national, even international. A person could be known by millions without ever meeting them. only through images on a screen. But beneath the glamour, the industry was still developing its structure. Studios controlled production tightly. Contracts shaped careers. And the relationship between performer and audience became increasingly mediated by institutions. This created both opportunity and limitation, a system that could elevate individuals quickly, but also control the terms of their visibility. Still, for audiences, cinema represented something powerful, an escape, a reflection, a constructed world that felt both distant and familiar. In a decade already defined by speed and change, film offered something slightly different: the ability to pause time, to watch a moment unfold, framed and contained, without needing to participate in its creation. And as the Roaring Twenties moved forward, Hollywood would continue to grow in influence, eventually becoming one of the central cultural engines of the modern world. But in these early years of silent cinema's rise, it still felt like something new, something experimental, a place where light and movement were slowly learning how to tell stories that the world had never quite seen in that way before. By the middle of the 1920s, something had taken hold of the American economy that felt, on the surface, almost effortless. Growth. Not the slow, uncertain kind that had defined earlier decades, but a steady, expanding sense that more was possible. More production. More consumption. More access to goods that had once been considered luxuries. Factories were operating at remarkable levels of efficiency. Assembly lines continued to refine the process of manufacturing, turning out products in greater volume and at lower cost than ever before. And as production increased, so did availability. Homes began to fill with new kinds of objects: refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, radios, automobiles, as described earlier, but now increasingly part of everyday life rather than novelty. These were not just tools. They became symbols of participation in modern life. To own them was to feel connected to progress itself. And at the center of this expanding economy was a powerful new force shaping human behavior in subtle but widespread ways: advertising. In earlier decades, advertising had existed, but it was relatively simple, informational, direct. But in the 1920s, it began to change in tone and sophistication. It no longer simply described products. It described lifestyles. A product was no longer just something you bought. It was something that represented who you were becoming, or who you wanted to be. Advertisements appeared in magazines, newspapers, billboards, and increasingly through radio. They spoke not just to needs, but to desires: comfort, status, modernity, convenience. And slowly, they helped shape a new kind of cultural imagination, one in which consumption was tied to identity. At the same time, credit systems began to expand. People were no longer always required to pay fully up front for larger purchases. Installment plans made it possible to acquire goods immediately and pay over time. This created a new rhythm of spending, one that extended purchasing power beyond immediate income. And in doing so, it increased the sense that prosperity was not only present, but accessible, almost continuous. The stock market also began to capture increasing public attention during this period. What had once been a relatively specialized financial space began to feel more approachable to a wider segment of the population. Stories of gains circulated widely. Investments were discussed in everyday conversation. There was a growing sense that economic expansion could continue indefinitely, that the upward trajectory of the decade might not slow. And this belief, while powerful, also carried a quiet tension beneath it, because much of the growth was uneven. Agriculture, for example, faced different conditions than urban industry. Farmers often struggled with overproduction and falling prices, even as cities experienced visible prosperity. This contrast created two overlapping economic realities within the same country, one expanding, one struggling. But in the public imagination of the time, especially in urban centers, the sense of prosperity often dominated. Department stores became physical expressions of this new consumer culture. Large, organized spaces filled with goods arranged for display and appeal. Shopping became less about necessity alone and more about experience. Browsing, comparing, imagining new possibilities. Even window displays became carefully designed forms of visual persuasion. Urban life itself began to incorporate consumption into its rhythm, not just working and living, but purchasing as a regular, expected part of modern existence. And beneath it all was a growing belief that economic expansion was natural, that the systems producing this abundance were stable, reliable, self-sustaining. It was not always stated explicitly, but it was widely felt, a kind of quiet confidence in progress. At the same time, this expanding consumer culture was tightly connected to the broader changes of the decade. Radio spread advertisements into homes. Film subtly reflected modern lifestyles. Automobiles enabled access to new retail spaces and suburbs. Technology and consumption reinforced each other, each expansion supporting the next. And so the economy became not just a system of production and exchange, but a cultural environment. One in which daily life was increasingly shaped by goods, services, and the idea of continuous improvement through acquisition. Yet even within this sense of growth, there were early signs of imbalance. Debt was increasing alongside spending. Speculation was growing in financial markets. And not all sectors of the economy were experiencing the same level of stability. But in the middle years of the decade, these signals often remained in the background, overshadowed by visible prosperity, and by the feeling that modern life itself was accelerating towards something larger, something still unfolding, something that had not yet reached its limit. For many living through it, the 1920s economy felt like motion without visible friction, a system that continued forward with little apparent resistance. And in that feeling, consumer culture became more than economic behavior. It became part of the identity of the decade itself, a quiet assumption that life was not only meant to continue, but to expand. In the middle of the Roaring Twenties, beneath the brightness of cities, the rhythm of jazz, and the rising confidence of modern life, there was another current running quietly through culture. It was not always visible in storefronts or advertisements. It was not measured in production numbers or stock prices. It existed instead in books, paintings, essays, and private conversations. A sense that something deeper was unsettled, that beneath the surface of progress, there was a feeling that the world had changed too quickly to fully understand itself. Writers of this period began to capture that feeling in different ways, some through clarity, others through fragmentation, others still through a kind of deliberate disillusionment. They became known, later, as part of what is often called the Lost Generation, a group of writers who came of age during or after World War I and found themselves living in a world that no longer matched the assumptions they had grown up with. Among them were figures like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, writers whose work often reflected a tension between outward glamour and inner emptiness, a contrast between the brightness of modern life and the uncertainty that lingered beneath it. In novels and short stories, Characters moved through spaces that were often elegant, fast-paced, and socially vibrant, yet emotionally unstable. Parties that felt both alive and hollow. Relationships that seemed meaningful but fragile. Lives shaped by wealth, travel, and social motion, but also by a quiet sense of disconnection. Fitzgerald, in particular, captured something essential about the era. Not just its surface beauty, but its emotional undertone. A feeling that prosperity and pleasure did not always resolve into lasting fulfillment. At the same time, Hemingway's style reflected a different kind of response. Sparse language, direct observation, a focus on what was left unsaid as much as what was written. Both approaches, in different ways, suggested that traditional storytelling forms were no longer sufficient on their own, that the modern world required new ways of expression. Beyond literature, art itself was undergoing transformation. In Europe especially, movements like Dadaism and Surrealism were emerging, rejecting conventional structure, experimenting with randomness, abstraction, and the unconscious mind. Art was no longer always about representation. It could be about disruption, about questioning what meaning itself looked like. Even in more traditional forms, painters and sculptors were beginning to explore modern themes. Urban landscapes, mechanical forms, geometric abstraction, a visual language that reflected the speed and fragmentation of modern life. There was a sense that the old artistic frameworks, rooted in realism and classical balance, were no longer enough to contain the complexity of the present. Literature and art were not separate from the broader changes of the decade. They were part of the same atmosphere, a response to a world that was expanding outward technologically, economically, and socially, while also feeling inwardly uncertain. The more the modern world accelerated, the more artists seemed to pause and question what that acceleration meant. This tension between movement and reflection became one of the defining qualities of cultural life in the 1920s. On one side, there was celebration. Jazz clubs, cinema, automobiles, advertising, consumer culture, a sense of energy and expansion. On the other side, there was introspection. Writers and artists trying to understand what was being gained, and what might be quietly slipping away. Even language itself began to shift in this period. Dialogue in literature became more naturalistic, less formal, closer to how people actually spoke in cities and social environments. Narrative structure sometimes became less linear, reflecting the fragmented experience of modern life. Time in stories did not always move in straight lines. Memory, perception, and emotion began to play larger roles in shaping narrative. And through all of this, a subtle question continued to appear again and again in different forms. What does it mean to live meaningfully in a world that is changing faster than interpretation can keep up with? The Roaring Twenties, from this perspective, was not only an age of external change. It was also an age of internal adjustment, a period in which people were learning how to think about themselves differently, how to write differently, how to see differently, and how to express experiences that did not fit neatly into older forms. But even this sense of restlessness was not uniform. Some embraced modernity fully, finding inspiration in its speed and novelty. Others resisted it, holding on to older traditions of structure and meaning. Most lived somewhere in between, negotiating daily life in a world that was neither fully new nor fully old. And so art and literature became, in many ways, a record of that negotiation, a way of holding still, even briefly, the feeling of a world in motion, not to stop it, but to understand it. And as the decade continued, that sense of restlessness would not disappear. It would deepen, spread into other areas of life, and eventually contribute to a broader awareness that beneath the glamour and progress of the 1920s, something more fragile was also taking shape. In the story of the 1920s, much of the focus often falls on cities, technology, entertainment, and the sense of rapid modern change. But beneath those visible transformations, another movement was reshaping the cultural and social landscape of the United States in profound ways. It was a movement of people, of families, of communities seeking new possibilities in unfamiliar places. This was the Great Migration, beginning in the early decades of the 20th century and continuing strongly through the 1920s. Millions of African Americans left the rural South and moved toward northern and Midwestern cities. They were driven by many forces at once: economic hardship in agricultural regions, limited opportunity in segregated systems, and the hope that cities might offer something different, something more open, something more possible. This movement changed the shape of cities almost immediately. Neighborhoods expanded, new cultural centers formed, and the demographic composition of urban life shifted in ways that would have lasting consequences. But migration was never simply about geography. It was also about culture and identity. As people moved, they carried with them traditions, music, language patterns, and community structures that would deeply influence the cities they entered. One of the most significant cultural developments to emerge from this period was the Harlem Renaissance. Centered in New York City, particularly in the Harlem neighborhood, it became a flourishing of African American art, literature, music, and intellectual life. Writers, poets, musicians, and thinkers gathered in a shared creative environment that was both locally rooted and nationally influential. Jazz music, already developing in earlier chapters, found new expression here as well, expanding in style, visibility, and cultural significance. It became not only entertainment, but also a form of artistic identity, a way of expressing complexity, emotion, and lived experience in ways that traditional forms often could not fully capture. Poets and writers of the Harlem Renaissance explored themes of identity, dignity, struggle, and creativity. They examined what it meant to live in a society marked by both cultural innovation and systemic inequality. Their work was diverse in tone, sometimes celebratory, sometimes reflective, sometimes deeply critical, and it helped establish a broader recognition of African American cultural contributions to modern American life. Yet alongside this flourishing of creativity, the reality of the 1920s remained uneven. Migration did not erase segregation or discrimination. In many northern cities, new arrivals encountered housing restrictions, employment barriers, and social tensions. Neighborhood boundaries often became sites of division as well as community formation, and cultural growth existed alongside ongoing inequality. This duality defined much of the era: progress and restriction, opportunity and limitation, expansion and conflict. At the same time, racial tensions also manifested in broader political and social movements. Nativist sentiments grew in certain regions, fueled by fears of change and demographic shifts. Immigration debates intensified, particularly regarding arrivals from Southern and Eastern Europe, and the question of national identity became increasingly contested. What did it mean to belong in a rapidly changing society? Who was included in the definition of modern America? And who was excluded from it? These questions did not have simple answers in the 1920s. Instead, they existed in tension, reflected in laws, public discourse, and everyday life. But even amid these tensions, cultural exchange continued to shape the decade in meaningful ways. Music, in particular, became one of the most powerful bridges across communities. Jazz, blues, and emerging popular forms circulated widely through radio, performance venues, and recording technology, influencing audiences far beyond their original geographic and cultural origins. This circulation was not always equal or fully acknowledged, but it was deeply transformative. It helped shape the sound of the decade itself, and it reinforced the idea that culture in the 1920s was increasingly interconnected, even when society itself was divided. Migration also reshaped the physical experience of cities. New neighborhoods formed. Churches, clubs, newspapers, and social organizations developed to support growing communities. Urban life became more layered, more complex, more interconnected across different lived experiences. Yet these layers did not always blend smoothly. Tensions could emerge quickly, sometimes economically, sometimes socially, sometimes violently, and so the 1920s contained within it a constant negotiation between integration and separation, between shared culture and divided experience, between visibility and marginalization. Still, the creative energy of the period remained undeniable. The Harlem Renaissance, in particular, stands as one of the most significant cultural developments of the decade, not because it resolved the inequalities of its time, but because it demonstrated the depth, richness, and complexity of artistic expression emerging within it. It showed that modern culture was not being shaped in a single place or by a single voice, but by many voices at once, each contributing to a broader and more complicated understanding of what the modern world was becoming. And as the decade continued, these overlapping experiences, migration, creativity, tension, and transformation, would remain central to the story of the 1920s. A story not defined by a single narrative, but by many histories unfolding together in the same changing world. In the middle years of the 1920s, beneath the noise of cities and the speed of modern life, another kind of tension was taking shape across the United States. It was not always visible in the same way as automobiles, radio broadcasts, or jazz music. It appeared instead in classrooms, in courtrooms, in sermons delivered on Sunday mornings in small towns and large cities alike. It was a tension between different ways of understanding the world, between tradition and modern science, between inherited belief and emerging knowledge. And at the center of this tension was a question that had existed for much longer than the decade itself. How should the world be explained? For many people in the 1920s, religion remained a central part of daily life. Churches were active social spaces. Religious communities shaped values, education, and identity. And for some, religious interpretation provided a stable framework in a rapidly changing world. But at the same time, scientific ideas were becoming more widely taught and discussed than ever before, especially in public education. One of the most visible flashpoints of this conflict came in 1925, in what became known as the Scopes monkey trial. The trial took place in Tennessee and centered on a teacher, John T. Scopes, who was accused of violating a state law that prohibited the teaching of evolution in public schools. On one side of the courtroom stood advocates for traditional interpretations of creation as described in religious texts. On the other stood defenders of academic freedom and scientific theory, particularly the ideas of Charles Darwin and evolutionary biology. The trial quickly became more than a local legal case. It became a national spectacle. Reporters from across the country covered the proceedings. Public figures debated the implications, and the courtroom itself became a stage for a broader cultural struggle. The question was not only about what could be taught in schools. It was about what kind of society the United States was becoming, one rooted primarily in tradition, or one increasingly shaped by scientific and modernist thinking. The Scopes trial did not resolve this tension, but it made it visible. It revealed how deeply divided perspectives could exist within the same country, sometimes within the same communities, and it showed how education had become a key arena in the struggle over cultural identity. At the same time, religious movements in the 1920s were also evolving. Fundamentalist interpretations of Christianity gained influence in some regions, emphasizing literal readings of Scripture and resistance to modernist reinterpretations. These movements were not simply reactions. For many participants, they represented stability, a way to preserve meaning in a world that felt increasingly fast-moving and uncertain. On the other side, modernist religious thinkers sought to reconcile faith with scientific discovery, attempting to interpret religious belief in ways that could coexist with evolution, geology, and emerging understandings of the natural world. And so, even within religion itself, there was not a single unified position, but rather a spectrum of responses to modernity. Science, meanwhile, was advancing rapidly in many fields. Biology, physics, medicine, and psychology were all undergoing significant development. New theories and discoveries were changing how people understood human behavior, disease, and the structure of the physical world. These changes did not always enter public awareness in detail, but their influence filtered outward through education, media, and professional practice. And as science expanded its reach, it increasingly shaped public conversations about progress, truth, and authority. This created a cultural environment in which two powerful systems of meaning, religion and science, were often seen as being in dialogue, and sometimes in opposition. But the reality was more complex than simple conflict. For many individuals, these systems coexisted in personal ways. Scientific explanations guided practical life. Religious belief guided moral and emotional life. And the boundary between them was not always rigid. Still, the public discourse of the 1920s often emphasized contrast, especially in moments like the Scopes trial, where legal argument became a symbolic representation of broader cultural divides. Beyond religion and science, the decade also saw other forms of social organization responding to modern change. Educational systems expanded. Literacy rates increased. Public debates about curriculum and knowledge became more prominent, and the role of institutions in shaping belief and understanding became more visible than ever before. At the same time, new media like radio began to influence how these debates were perceived, broadcasting discussions, news updates, and commentary into homes across the country, turning local issues into national conversations. In this way, even intellectual and cultural conflict became part of mass culture, something experienced collectively, rather than only within specific communities or regions. And as the 1920s progressed, the tension between tradition and modernity did not disappear. It became one of the defining undercurrents of the decade, appearing not only in courts and classrooms, but in literature, art, entertainment, and everyday conversation, a quiet but persistent question running beneath the surface of modern life. How do you hold on to meaning in a world that is constantly changing what meaning looks like? And as the decade moved toward its later years, that question would only become more pressing, as the structures of modern society continued to expand, evolve, and sometimes collide, all within the same rapidly transforming world. By the late 1920s, the world of the Roaring Twenties still appeared, from a distance, to be moving in one direction: upward, forward, expanding. Cities were brighter than they had ever been. Radio signals filled homes with constant sound. Factories continued to produce goods at remarkable speed. And the language of the decade still carried confidence. Confidence in progress, in innovation, in growth that seemed to have no clear endpoint. But beneath this visible surface, something quieter was beginning to shift. Not abruptly. Not in a way that most people would immediately notice. More like a slow settling of weight beneath polished floors. A subtle imbalance forming within a system that had, for years, seemed almost frictionless. Part of this imbalance came from the very efficiency that defined the decade. Factories were producing more goods than ever before. Assembly lines had become highly refined systems of output, capable of sustaining enormous levels of production. But production alone is only one side of an economy. The other side is demand. And over time, those two sides were beginning to drift slightly out of alignment. In some industries, goods were being produced faster than they could be absorbed at the same pace by consumers. Warehouses held surplus inventory. Prices in certain sectors began to soften. And in agricultural regions, this imbalance was even more visible. Farmers, who had expanded production during wartime demand earlier in the decade, now found themselves facing falling crop prices. More supply. Less stable income. A quieter form of strain that contrasted sharply with the visible prosperity of urban centers. In cities, however, the sense of abundance remained strong. Department stores were full. New products continued to appear. Advertising reinforced the idea that modern life was continuously improving through consumption. And installment credit made it possible for many people to participate in this expanding economy without immediate full payment. This created a powerful illusion of accessibility, a sense that prosperity was not only present, but ongoing, even renewable. But behind this expanding consumer culture, financial behavior was also changing in more complex ways. The stock market, once relatively distant from everyday life, had become increasingly woven into public conversation. Stock prices were discussed in offices, cafes, and social gatherings. Stories of rapid gains circulated widely. Investment began to feel less like a specialized activity and more like a shared cultural experience. And with that shift came a growing belief that markets could continue rising indefinitely. That fluctuations were temporary, that the overall direction of growth was stable enough to rely upon. This confidence, while widespread, was not evenly grounded across all parts of the economy. Some sectors were expanding steadily, others were already experiencing strain. But those differences were often less visible in the daily experience of urban life, where signs of prosperity were more immediate and more concentrated. At the same time, credit expansion meant that both individuals and businesses were increasingly operating with borrowed resources. Money circulated more quickly, but also more loosely. Debt, while manageable under stable conditions, added layers of dependency within the system. And those dependencies were not always fully visible in everyday transactions. Banks, businesses, and investors were connected through increasingly complex financial relationships, each relying, in different ways, on continued stability in others. And so the system, while appearing strong, was also becoming more interconnected in ways that made it harder to isolate risk. Still, in the atmosphere of the late 1920s, these structural details were not at the center of public attention. The dominant feeling remained one of momentum, the idea that modern life was not only advancing, but accelerating, that innovation would continue to generate new opportunity, that prosperity, once achieved, would naturally sustain itself. This belief was reinforced by the visible symbols of success all around. Skyscrapers continued to rise in major cities, embodying vertical growth. Automobiles continued to spread across roads, reshaping mobility. Film and radio continued to expand cultural reach, and consumer goods became increasingly integrated into daily routines. Everything seemed to point in the same direction, forward. But economic systems rarely move in straight lines. They develop unevenly. They accumulate pressure in areas that are not always immediately visible. And in the late 1920s, those pressures were quietly increasing. Banking practices in some regions were becoming more speculative. Loans were being extended with confidence in continued growth. Investments were sometimes made with less caution than earlier periods might have suggested. And while many institutions remained stable, the overall system was becoming more sensitive to shifts in confidence. Because in a highly interconnected economy, perception itself can become part of stability. As long as confidence remains high, systems continue to function smoothly. But if that confidence begins to waver, even slightly, the effects can spread more quickly than expected. None of this was fully apparent in the everyday experience of most people during these years. Life still felt active, modern, full of movement and possibility. But in hindsight, the late 1920s can be seen as a period in which the structure beneath that movement was becoming more complex, more layered, and more dependent on continued trust. And trust, while powerful, is also fragile in large systems. By the end of the decade, the visible world of prosperity would still appear intact. But beneath it, the quiet accumulation of imbalance was already in place. Like tension building in a structure that still stands firm on the outside, while adjusting silently within. And as the story of the 1920s moves toward its final years, that tension will begin to matter more. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, as the illusion of endless expansion begins to meet the limits of reality. By the closing years of the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties still appeared, on the surface, to be in full motion. Cities remained bright with electric light. Music still drifted from radios and dance halls. Automobiles still filled roads that had been expanding for nearly a decade. And the language of modern life still carried optimism, confidence in technology, industry, and the continued upward trajectory of progress. But beneath this familiar surface, the tone of the decade was beginning to shift. Not suddenly. Not in a way that most people could clearly identify at the time. More like a change in atmosphere. A subtle difference in how the same world began to feel when experienced day after day. The economic system that had supported so much of the decade's expansion was now more complex, more interconnected, and more dependent on continued confidence than ever before. And confidence, while powerful, is also delicate. It exists not only in numbers and institutions, but in perception, in expectation, in belief about what tomorrow will look like compared to today. Throughout the late 1920s, that belief remained largely intact. Stock markets continued to rise through much of the period. Investing had become increasingly common across different levels of society. Credit remained widely available, supporting continued consumer spending. And many of the visible signs of prosperity were still present in everyday life. Department stores remained busy. New products continued to appear. Advertising still reinforced the idea that modern life was defined by improvement and expansion. Yet even in these years of apparent stability, the system was becoming more sensitive to change. Not weaker in an obvious sense, but more dependent on continued alignment between many interconnected parts. Banks, investors, businesses, and consumers were all linked through a growing network of financial relationships. And within that network, small shifts in behavior could, under certain conditions, produce larger effects than before. At the same time, certain imbalances that had developed earlier in the decade were still present. Some industries had expanded faster than others. Some regions experienced sustained prosperity, while others faced ongoing strain. Agricultural communities, in particular, continued to struggle with low prices and overproduction, even as urban centers maintained an image of growth and abundance. These differences did not always appear in the same frame of public attention. The experience of the 1920s was not uniform. It varied significantly depending on geography, occupation, and social position. But the dominant narrative of the era, especially in urban and financial centers, remained one of progress, of upward movement, of expansion that seemed, if not infinite, then at least stable enough to continue. By the end of the decade, this narrative had become deeply embedded in cultural life. Modern identity itself was often associated with consumption, mobility, and participation in a rapidly evolving economy. To live modernly was to engage with new goods, new technologies, new forms of entertainment, and new financial possibilities. And for a time, this framework appeared to hold. But systems that rely heavily on growth and confidence also require constant reinforcement. They depend on expectations being met repeatedly over time. And when expectations begin to drift, even slightly, the effects can accumulate. Not immediately visible, but gradually forming pressure beneath the surface. As 1928 gave way to 1929, these pressures were still largely contained within the structure of the economy. Visible prosperity continued. Public optimism remained strong, and the cultural energy of the decade had not yet fully dimmed. But in hindsight, this period can be seen as the edge of transition, a moment when the outward appearance of stability still held, while the underlying conditions were becoming more complex and more fragile. There was no single moment when everything changed, no clear boundary that separated stability from disruption. Instead, there was a gradual tightening, a quiet accumulation of conditions that would later converge in ways that reshaped the course of history. And so the final years of the Roaring Twenties exist in memory as a kind of suspended moment, still bright, still active, still full of movement, but increasingly shaped by systems that were reaching the limits of their current form. And as the decade approached its end, the sense of continuous expansion would soon encounter a reality that had been building quietly beneath it all along, not yet visible in full, but already present, waiting in the structure of the world itself. By 1929, the Roaring Twenties still looked, at first glance, much like it had for most of the decade. The same bright storefronts, the same crowded city streets, the same radios carrying voices into living rooms across the country, and the same steady belief, widely held, that modern life was continuing its upward climb. But beneath that familiar surface, the system that supported this sense of expansion had become increasingly sensitive, not visibly fragile in a way most people could recognize day to day, but tightly connected, interdependent, and reliant on continued confidence moving in one direction, forward. The stock market, which had become one of the most visible symbols of the decade's prosperity, was still widely discussed and actively participated in by people from many different parts of society. Investing had become almost ordinary in certain circles, something discussed casually alongside work, family, and daily routines. Prices had risen significantly over the course of the decade, reinforcing the belief that growth was not only ongoing, but dependable. That belief was powerful and widely shared. But markets, by their nature, are not only shaped by economic reality, they are also shaped by expectations. And expectations can shift more quickly than underlying systems can adjust. In the months leading up to the final months of 1929, there were moments of volatility. Short periods where prices fell, then recovered. Fluctuations that were interpreted by many as temporary corrections rather than signals of deeper instability. The broader narrative of prosperity remained intact in public life. Factories continued producing goods. Automobiles continued to fill roads. Radio and film continued to expand cultural influence. And consumer culture remained deeply embedded in everyday experience. But beneath these visible signs of stability, financial structures were increasingly dependent on credit and speculation. Loans were often used to purchase stocks, amplifying both gains and risks. Banks and investors were tied together through complex financial relationships that functioned smoothly under stable conditions, but could become strained if confidence began to shift significantly. And in 1929, that confidence began to show signs of strain. Not all at once, but in a series of movements that gradually changed the tone of the market. By October of that year, the tension within the financial system became impossible to ignore. Stock prices began to fall more sharply. Selling increased, and what had once been steady optimism began to turn into uncertainty. In late October, the market experienced a dramatic collapse, a sudden acceleration of selling that overwhelmed the system's ability to stabilize itself in the short term. This moment, later known as the Wall Street crash of 1929, became one of the most significant turning points in modern economic history. But in real time, it did not arrive as a single, fully understood event. It unfolded across days of confusion, fear, and rapidly changing expectations. As prices fell, people who had invested heavily on credit found themselves facing losses that exceeded their available resources. Banks, tied to these investments, came under pressure, and the interconnected nature of the system meant that stress in one area quickly influenced others. Still, it is important to understand that the crash did not emerge from a single cause alone. It was the result of many overlapping conditions that had developed over the course of the decade. Rapid industrial expansion, uneven distribution of prosperity, heavy reliance on credit, speculative investment practices, and a widespread belief that growth would continue indefinitely. When those expectations began to shift, even slightly, the system reacted quickly. And that reaction reshaped the trajectory of the economy in ways that would extend far beyond 1929 itself. But in the immediate moment, what people experienced was uncertainty, confusion, and a sudden interruption in the narrative of continuous expansion that had defined much of the decade. For many, it was difficult to fully grasp what was happening as it unfolded. News traveled quickly through radio and newspapers, but understanding lagged behind events. Some believed the decline would be temporary. Others recognized that something more serious was occurring, and many simply waited, hoping for stabilization. But the momentum of the downturn continued, and what had begun as a financial collapse would soon expand outward into broader economic consequences. Business activity slowed. Banks became more cautious. Credit tightened, and the sense of easy prosperity that had characterized the 1920s began to fade. Yet even in this moment of disruption, it is important to recognize that the transition was not instantaneous in its full effects. The structures of daily life did not change overnight. Factories still operated. Cities still functioned. People still worked, traveled, and lived within systems that remained intact, even as they came under increasing strain. But the direction had clearly shifted. The assumption of continuous expansion was no longer reliable, and a new period was beginning to take shape, one defined not by unbroken growth, but by adjustment, by contraction, by the slow realization that the systems of the previous decade had reached a turning point. And as 1929 came to a close, the Roaring Twenties itself was no longer simply a living era. It had become history in motion, a decade that had moved with remarkable speed, now beginning to give way to something very different. By the time the 1920s came to a close, the decade no longer felt like a single, unified moment. It felt instead like something that had already begun to drift slightly out of reach. Not gone, not yet fully transformed, but no longer fully present in the way it once had been. The sounds were still there. Jazz still played in clubs and dance halls. Radios still carried voices into quiet rooms at night. Films still flickered across screens, offering brief escapes into constructed worlds of light and movement. And cities still moved with the same mechanical rhythm they had developed over the course of the decade. Crowded sidewalks, rising buildings, and the constant hum of modern life. But something subtle had changed in how all of it was experienced. A sense that the forward motion that had defined the 1920s was no longer effortless, no longer assumed. The financial systems that had supported much of the decade's visible expansion were already under strain in ways that had become impossible to ignore in hindsight, even if they were still not fully understood in the moment. The stock market crash of 1929 had already marked a clear break in the narrative of continuous growth. But in the immediate aftermath, the full scope of what that break would mean had not yet fully unfolded. At first, there was still hope that the disruption would be temporary, that markets would stabilize, that confidence would return, that the structures of prosperity built over the decade would continue with only minor adjustment. But as time moved forward, it became increasingly clear that the effects were deeper than a short-term correction. Banks faced pressure. Credit tightened. Businesses slowed hiring or reduced operations. And the interconnected systems that had once amplified growth now began to transmit instability more widely. What made this shift so significant was not only the economic change itself, but the contrast it created with the decade that had just ended. The 1920s had been defined, in memory and experience, by expansion, by acceleration, by the feeling that modern life was not only progressing, but doing so with increasing speed and confidence. Automobiles had changed mobility. Radio had changed communication. Film had changed storytelling. Industry had changed production. Advertising had changed desire. And together, these forces had created a cultural atmosphere that felt constantly in motion. Even the uncertainties of the decade, cultural tension, uneven prosperity, social conflict, had existed within that broader sense of forward movement. But now, that movement was no longer guaranteed. The end of the decade revealed how closely that sense of expansion had been tied to financial confidence, and how quickly expectations could shift when that confidence was disrupted. Yet even in this transition, the 1920s did not disappear all at once. Its cultural legacy remained deeply embedded in everyday life. Jazz did not vanish. It continued to evolve. Cinema did not stop. It entered new phases of development. Radio did not fade. It became even more central to communication in the years ahead. Automobiles remained essential, reshaping infrastructure and daily life in lasting ways. And consumer culture, though affected by economic change, did not disappear either. It had already altered how people thought about goods, identity, and modern living. In that sense, the Roaring Twenties did not end cleanly. It dissolved gradually into a new era, carrying its structures forward even as its confidence diminished. Looking back, the decade can be seen as a period of rapid transformation in nearly every aspect of life. Urban growth, technological acceleration, cultural experimentation, shifts in identity, communication, and consumption, a widening sense of connection across distance, and an equally important sense of tension beneath that connection, between old systems and new realities, between optimism and instability, between expansion and imbalance. It was a decade that felt, for many who lived through it, like a continuous unfolding, a world learning how to move faster than it had ever moved before, and learning, slowly, what that speed made possible, and what it made fragile. As the 1930s began to emerge from the shadow of the 1920s, the contrast would become even clearer. But the story of the Roaring Twenties itself remains defined by this central arc: a rise in motion, a rise in confidence, a rise in modern life as something fast, connected, and newly imagined. And then, at its end, a quiet slowing, not an ending that felt dramatic in the moment, but one that, in hindsight, marked the close of a distinct chapter in modern history. A decade that roared, and then, gently at first, fell quiet. The Roaring Twenties did not begin with a roar, and in many ways, it did not end with a single sound either. Instead, it unfolded like a long, accelerating breath, drawn in after the silence of war, held through years of expansion, and slowly released as the decade gave way to uncertainty. Looking back, the 1920s can feel like a collection of contradictions held together by motion. It was a decade of celebration and exhaustion, of innovation and imbalance, of cultural freedom and cultural tension existing side by side, often in the same city, sometimes in the same street, sometimes even within the same moment. It was a time when modern life began to recognize itself as modern. Cities stopped feeling like extensions of older rural rhythms and became something entirely new: vertical, electric, crowded, and constantly active. Radio removed distance from sound. Film removed distance from imagination. Automobiles removed distance from geography. And together, these changes reshaped how people experience time, space, and one another. Life became faster, not only in movement, but in perception. News arrived more quickly. Entertainment circulated more widely. Fashion changed more visibly. And ideas spread with a speed that earlier generations had never experienced. But alongside this acceleration came a quieter transformation, a sense that the world was no longer stable in the same way it once had been. That progress, while real and visible, was also uneven. That prosperity, while widespread in some places, was not universal. And that beneath the surface of growth, complex systems were forming, systems of credit, production, consumption, and speculation that depended heavily on continued confidence. The end of the decade revealed how closely modern life had become tied to expectation. Not just what was happening, but what people believed would continue happening. And when that expectation shifted, even slightly, the effects moved quickly through the interconnected structures of the economy. But the 1920s cannot be reduced only to its ending. Its legacy is far larger than the moment it concluded. It was the decade that helped define mass culture as we understand it. A shared experience shaped by radio broadcasts, film audiences, advertising messages, and rapidly expanding consumer goods. It was the decade that helped establish the modern city as a central stage of life, a place of density, opportunity, anonymity, and constant motion. It was the decade that brought jazz into public consciousness, not only as music, but as a symbol of improvisation, freedom, and cultural transformation. It was also a decade of migration, of artistic experimentation, of social tension, and of changing identities. A period in which many different histories were unfolding at once, often in parallel, sometimes in conflict, and always in motion. To call it simply roaring is to capture only part of its meaning. The roar suggests noise, celebration, and energy, and all of that was present. But so too were quieter forces: uncertainty, restlessness, adjustment, and the slow realization that modern life was becoming something more complex than any single narrative could contain. In the end, the Roaring Twenties is best understood not as a single story, but as a convergence of many stories, some bright, some uneasy, some still unfolding in their consequences long after the decade itself had ended. And as the world moved into the 1930s, it did not leave the 1920s behind so much as carry it forward in altered form. Its technologies remained. Its cultural innovations endured. Its systems continued to shape daily life. But its sense of effortless expansion gave way to a more complicated reality. Still modern, still connected, but no longer roaring in quite the same way. What remains, then, is not just the memory of a decade, but the recognition that it was a turning point, a moment when the modern world learned to move faster than ever before, and then began to understand what that speed would require in return, quietly, gradually, and permanently. Good night.